still no word from Treasury on whether it will or not it will bail out the South African Post Office. 3.8 billion rand needed for that bailout. Otherwise, the post office may be forced into liquidation. It means that all jobs are lost. 657 operational branches, that's 647 post office branches that are still open, will then be sold off to the highest bidder. Lots to talk about. Can we live and operate without a South African post office? Remember, last week we spoke to Donald Valoy. He's the founder of Zulzi, is one of the many local entrepreneurial courier companies who says, yes, we could benefit if the South African post office fails, but rather we didn't, because the South African public still relies quite heavily on the South African Post Office. Solly Malatsi is the Minister of Communications and Digital Technologies. Good morning, Minister. Really appreciate your time. That 3.8 billion rand bailout. Any word yet on whether Treasury is going to heed to the calls from the business rescue practitioners there?
Good morning, Lester, and morning to your listeners. No word as yet, but Treasury has been consistent in saying that what it needs to see from the business rescue practitioners is a plan that puts the post office on the path to being financially sustainable, and that is a reasonable request, because there has to be accountability for any drawdown that has been previously committed. But what I've proposed to my counterpart, and there's been warm reception to that, is the formation of a task team between the two departments that will look at proposals that can make the way for private investment scenarios in the post office. Because when you look at the history of how many times the state has had to rescue the post office in the last 10 years, that figure is extremely high. And we have to juxtapose it with accountability and delivery. The key thing here is a recognition that there is a need for post office. That need has to be found and funded in a way that it does not continually take away from the fiscus, and that, like any other entity, it must operate to be financially sustainable, and that if there are instances in the past where commitments from the Treasury have not been met, there has to be accountability for that.
Do you believe that the South African Post Office is too big to fail, too important for the South African public? Its footprint reaches to many, many small and particularly rural parts of the country. It's too important to simply let it go away?
Look, I think it's too important to allow it to fail. In doing so, it is also important to make sure that it is on the right trajectory to be financially sustainable, and that it doesn't take money away from other core services such as, education, such as policing, such as health, and that, like in any other environment, we have to anticipate that the future of public funding for these entities is going to become less and less reliant on the fiscus, because the fiscus is overstretched, right? And we have to get the right leadership in place. We have to do the right things in business, and we have to really look at ways that allow for some private investment in the post office, so that it can be able to generate revenue and look after itself. You are absolutely right. It has one of the widest footprints for any service delivery outlet. And I think, if you look down several years back, anyone in South Africa probably had a post office branch within 5-kilometer radius of where they were living, or had a post office service outlet nearby. But it is important to also inculcate a new culture in public entities, that you can't simply just, underperform and not function very well and rely entirely on being rescued by an injection from Treasury, when there needs to be performance, and the performance has to be accounted for.
So from what it sounds to me, that you're open to some form of equity partner, at least coming on board with the South African post office? Are prospective equity partners being sought out? Do you know of entities saying, you know what, we will come on board with the South African post office. We'll maybe absorb some of that debt. We'll find a way to recoup it. But in the meantime, we are saving the South African post office.
The conversation hasn't gotten that deep yet. There's a recognition of two things. The business risk practitioners have indicated that since they've come into office, there's been 39, I think, unsolicited bids for some form of private investment. But what we are trying to do, together with the support of Treasury, is let us proactively look at opportunities that would, suss out the market for any interest in terms of private investment, assess those through a team that we would have conjointly established, and then be able to see which is the best way for the future of the post office. The reality is that the post office has unfortunately been stuck in the past and hasn't evolved as fast as the market that it serves has evolved. But all is not lost because, as you said earlier, it's infrastructure, for instance. It has one of the largest portfolios of infrastructure. It is, serves the majority of poor South Africans, largely social grant beneficiaries, and we need to find a way of making sure that we keep it alive in order to have its services closer to many poor South Africans, and not make it expensive for poor South Africans to access postal and courier services. But surely it has to be grounded on the fact that it has to be financially sustainable. It has to be financially healthy. It has to increasingly generate revenue so that it can fund its operations.
I think we also need to look at what we do with the infrastructure, the buildings, but also the human capital of the South African Post Office. It's more than just a parcel courier service. It's more than just a place where you go to renew a fishing license. It's more than just a place where you go and collect a SASSA grant. These can be ICT hubs in particularly rural parts of South Africa. If you need a CV to be printed, you can organize facilities at the South African Post Office. Why do we need all of these small internet cafes being part of? If we want to talk about digital connectivity, we can also talk about the South African Post Office being that hub in a particularly rural part of the country, Minister.
Look, that is fair, and I think that is the direction it should be going into. And all of these things, can only be realized with one, getting the right team, getting the right personnel, but most importantly, getting it the funding that it requires in order to keep operating. I think the future of, the post office is not entirely going to be, as you correctly point out, just naively looking at, what the market, its market has always been in terms of postal and courier services. I think there's going to be innovation that is inserted into how we leverage its infrastructure and its proximity to many poor South Africans and enhance digital connection for many poor South Africans who are not as yet connected. What has happened in the past few years is that, due to underinvestment in the infrastructure, the technological infrastructure that is needed, it hasn't been able to adapt to the demands of the markets. And the business rescuers had to make difficult decisions since they've come into office, which have led to some job losses, which are unfortunate, and also, rationalizing some of the infrastructure to at least cover some cost. But I think we really need to be having a sober conversation about, how do we make sure at the end of the day that South Africans who are not connected, digitally connected as yet, can be connected, can have access to postal and courier services and all the other related social development services that they have historically always accessed post office. And then there's got to be proper leadership there, and there's got to be accountability for public finances.
Solly Malatsi, Minister of Communications and Digital Technologies.